Welcome to Clause 8, presented by TradeSpace, where the voices of IP come together to talk about the forces shaping the industry today. If you enjoy this show, please take a minute to subscribe on clause8podcast.com for any updates and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And don't forget to give it a 5-star review while you're there. Today's episode is with Erich Spangenberg. His critics have called him one of the most notorious patent trolls in America. Many others have tried and failed to emulate his success. Either way, it's hard to deny that he is a singular visionary in the world of patents. As the founder of IPwe, he completed over 1,000 licensing transactions worth billions of dollars. To the surprise of many, he then joined forces with hedge fund manager Kyle Bass to challenge pharma patents under the AIA. More recently, he founded IPwe, a blockchain-based platform for patent transactions. In this episode, Erich discusses how he got into the patent world, strategies in patent monetization, and his future vision for IPwe.
And not every patent asset's a great one. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of them aren't. But when you have a good one, manage it intelligently. Don't manage it like an advocate.
And now, here's your host, Eli Mauser.
Thank you so much for joining Clause 8.
You're welcome. It's good to be here, Eli.
And I want to give a shout out to a former Clause 8 guest, Lillian Shaked, who was a lawyer for Erich and helped coordinate that.
One of the best I've worked with. She's amazing. I'm actually starting up a new project with her next week. So I'm glad Lillian connected us.
So maybe we could start there. Like, what makes somebody an amazing lawyer for someone like you in your line of work?
Fast, contributes, and executes, right? Like it's what we need. Lily and I don't always agree, but I just saw something in her that was special. And so most of the lawyers are smart. I mean, some of them you want to hang out with, some of them you don't. It's not really the issue for me. But the people who can truly contribute and can truly make a difference, she's just amazing and good at what she does. And that's why today a bunch of litigation funders and licensing people who need license services use her. And I suspect there's very few in the world who've done as many licenses as her and seen the parade of horribles that happens when you don't have a ton of experience in the space.
What is your reaction to being called one of the most notorious patent trolls in America?
To me, it's meaningless, right? Let's just go there. So I was a partner at a big law firm in their restructuring and finance group. And what I realized is that lawyers always marketed themselves as smartest, hardest working, and best values. So let's just go over those real quick. So smartest. Well, that's a fool's game because there's always somebody smarter than you coming up or above you or peer to you, but rarely are you the smartest. And frankly, rarely even in the top 10%. So that's a loser's argument. Hardest working. Yeah, I don't want to die with he worked 3,500 hours a year. I mean, who cares if you're the hardest working or not? I want the most effective working for me. If you can get your job done in 2 hours, I never understood why law firms billed by the hour. I think it's a silly metric, but certainly not how I wanted to distinguish myself. And then best value, that's the last thing I want to be. I want to be the expensive solution. So how do you differentiate yourself? And so what I realized was, particularly in going out and doing patent assertion, which I did globally from the time I started, was that you had to start out to be the black hat. Very few people want to start out wearing the black hat. I just embraced it. And then over time, I knew what would happen. So I started in 2003. Before that, I couldn't spell the word patent. And by 2007, I had big companies calling me. I think it was an intelligent strategy. I mean, would I have liked to have done it a little differently? Sure. But I needed to start out wearing a black hat and then migrate to a gray hat. It was how I distinguished myself. So there was a New York Times article in 2010 that was just massively changed the trajectory of my career. And it really was a weird recognition. The smart people said, when I got a patent problem, I want that guy's advice. I want that guy helping me. I want that guy. And most of them I'd say no to. But, to this day, I work with a lot of smaller innovators, but I also occasionally work with some of the largest companies in the world. So that was how I did it, and that was why I did it. I mean, was there another strategy? Maybe, but not one that would work for me.
I mean, what do you think of a term in general, the term patent troll?
I mean, come on. Google used it to describe Microsoft in 2015 or whatever it was, when Microsoft was doing its last hurrah on forcing Google to pay either 10 or 15 bucks a phone. I can't remember what the number was. And that's what Google said about Microsoft. So again, the people who invented the word made it become meaningless. So it was actually the guy who claims credit for it was a guy who went from Intel to IV, Intellectual Ventures.
And that's Peter Decken, right?
Yeah, Peter Decken. So, I think Peter's at Boston Consulting Group now or something like that. So he's changed careers again. And then you look at Intel, and Intel sells off patents to various groups every now and then. A couple of years ago, they sold off 5,000 to somebody who all they're going to do is license them. So spare me the monikers. I don't buy into it.
But do you think it's been an effective, I guess?
Yeah, no. It helped me. It helped me. There was a time in my life where I could write 7 numbers on a sheet of paper and somebody would pay me. I mean, so it definitely helped. But I think that if it makes people who use the term feel better, knock yourselves out. I just don't care.
You said you didn't know how to spell patents. I'm sure it's a bit of over-exaggeration, but can you tell us the story of how you ended up interested in?
Yeah, no. So look, I wanted to be a rare earth metal trader. So I was at the London School of Economics, got a job. And 10 days before I was supposed to start, I got a letter. This was pre-email. And they said that they had been put into a receivership, which I wasn't even sure what that meant. But I understood the part that my offer had been withdrawn. So scrambled. I hadn't taken the LSAT, and there were only 2 law schools that would take me. I don't know why I picked law school, but I was in a full-scale panic and had days to figure it out. So this was like May, and I knew that law school was starting in, I think, August or September. So I had to find one who'd take me that late without the LSAT, which you need in the U.S. And there were only 2 that would even look at an application from me, Case Western and Emory. So I ended up at Case Western. They helped me out with tuition because I didn't have any money, and they found me a job. I didn't take any patent classes, anything like that. So I started at Jones Day as an associate, spent most of my time in the restructuring group, made partner, quit 6 months later, then went into finance at a firm called Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette in their high yield group, and then went into operations. So the first time I really paid any attention to patents was when the company I was at was being sued for patent infringement, and it was just pure fortuity. But I was running business development, and the CEO came in and said, hey, we've got $40 million left in our balance sheet. We're paying, I can't remember what it was, some crazy number a month to lawyers to defend patent infringement suits. And we were just sued by Ron Katz. Most people don't remember who Ron is, but he was clearly one of the best. He bought some patents in the telecom space from American Express and generated, I think, over $1 billion by the end of his career. In any event, we were using some big law firm, I can't remember who it was, and they said, well, no, you can't go talk to them, whatever you do. And naturally, that's what I did. So I jumped on a plane and went to talk to these companies who were suing us. And I realized that the people I was talking to had no idea what they were talking about, right? They were just mouthing back badly things that the lawyers had told them, but they had no idea what was or wasn't an issue. In any event, I settled a bunch of those, and then lo and behold, we got sued by Ron Katz. And Ron Katz was not somebody you wanted to, I read as much as I could about him, and clearly not somebody you wanted to mess with. So his offices were like 5 miles on the Wilshire corridor. So got a meeting with him. Again, the lawyer said no. And when I walked into his office, it was on the high floor in a beautiful building on Wilshire Boulevard. His secretary was sitting in front of these 2 doors, and she said, oh, Mr. Spangenberg, we were expecting you. The doors slide open, and I go into this office, and it looks like something out of Versailles. And it's Ron Katz, who is this relatively diminutive guy. And he was extremely cordial. And, he gave me a real brief explanation about the technology. And I'm like, Mr. Katz, no need. I've read the patents. I just want to know what you want. And he goes, well, like, what do you mean what I want? And I'm like, we want a license. And here's our balance sheet. Here's what we make from the products you're accusing of us violating. I didn't even use the word infringement at the time. And I said, we just don't want to mess with you. And I think that's exactly the words I used. And he said, well, how about $500,000? Our lawyers were telling us that he was going to ask us for tens of millions. I said, we'll take it if we can get the license agreement done today. So he called downstairs, and there was a woman who came up who was a lawyer, and she had their form licensing agreement. And she and I went off to a conference room. I'd never done a licensing agreement in my life, but I knew how to read a payment provision. So I just made sure the payment provision was right. The other licensing provisions seemed fine to me. I didn't care. It was non-exclusive and all that stuff. I understood what those words meant, but that was the first licensing agreement I ever met in my life. I literally signed it at around 7 o'clock that night. And so I said, one more condition I forgot to mention, that I want to meet with you once a month for a few months. And he said, no problem. So I would go and have lunch with him when he was free. So I literally learned how he saw things and what he was looking at and how he thought about things. And his focus was heavily on the telecommunications side, but I saw no reason that what he was talking about wouldn't apply to a bunch of technologies. So that was 1999, 2000. So over the course of 3 or 4 lunches and a day-long negotiating session, learned a ton from him. So don't pay any attention to patents. 2003, there was this company that I had a chance to buy with a friend of mine, and the company had a $12 million market cap and $18 million of cash on the balance sheet. It was the end of the dot-com era, and if you had dot-com in your name, you traded at a discount to cash. It was just insane. I've never seen it again. Anomaly doesn't begin to capture it. So we did a tender offer for the company. And my buddy said, hey, there's a patent portfolio here. Will you take a look at it? And I'm like, how do I know? But as I read it, I actually started to say, given the time that I'd had with Ron, I started to realize that they were interesting and they were relatively easy to understand and really short claims. And what this company had done is the CEO had come up with the idea of how the internet was going to take things that were offline, in this case, catalogs and things like that, and effectively put them online. Now, these would all be invalid under the AIA today, but at the time they were valid. So I bought those from him for $300,000, and that was how I got started in the patent space. And probably the two guys that had the most influence on me, other than Ron, was a guy named Bob Steinberg, who was a partner at Latham and Watkins, and he spent months with me explaining to me what's going on. Bob is a super smart guy. He was a patent examiner and a lawyer, and ultimately became a litigator. And then the younger associate who worked for him was a guy named Sean Pack, who's now one of the co-heads of IP at Quinn. So, I mean, I got trained by the best in the business. I don't think they realized they were training me, but they were. And so that was how I got into it. So by 2004, the thing that I added to it that other people didn't do was I did it globally, right? I was in China already. I had a Shanghai office since 2004. I was in Europe. And so we would surround people, and we're not the least bit reluctant to use foreign jurisdictions as leverage. So the metrics that we focused closely in on was time to cash. So in other words, if we spent $1 million or something, how long before we got our $1 million back? And then our return on capital, more important to us than an IRR, was the multiples of invested capital. So if we invested $1 million, I mean, it would be great if we could do a 30% IRR, but more importantly is that we could do multiples of that invested capital, because in 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7, other than intellectual ventures, it was almost impossible to raise capital for IP-related projects. I mean, nobody knew what you were talking about. It was completely foreign. And the only person of any success during that period who did it was Nathan Myrhold at IV, and I certainly was no Nathan Myrhold. So we did it all off that original $300,000 that I kicked in, and that was how we got started. And then the big transition for us was we went from doing it for our own account to starting to do it for third parties in 2007, and that was the big transition for us.
What's the big lesson that stands out to you that you learned from Ron Katz?
Yeah, so you know what? He gave me great advice. He knew that I was a lawyer, and he said, lawyers are a tool in the overall toolbox, but they're not the solution. And to their credit, Bob and Sean said the same thing to me, was that we're advocates. Like, we're taught to advocate. Don't ask us what we think, because we're so wrapped up in the advocacy training, which obviously I understood from law school as well, that we're not there. So what I would say several years later is, if you're going to do this for a living, be an asset manager, don't be an advocate. And an asset manager looks at things very differently than an advocate. And I think that's really what you need to do to be successful in the IP space, is think about how those assets are best managed. And for some, that's, quote, using them for defensive purposes. And for others, it's using them more aggressively. And it just depends on what your company or what you as an owner overall is looking to get out of them. And then obviously you have to have the right assets that'll perform, whoever it is. And so you have to realize that not every patent asset's a great one. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of them aren't. But when you have a good one, manage it intelligently. Don't manage it like an advocate.
You mentioned that your lawyers at the time, when you were the executive at this company, were telling you Ron Katz is going to ask $10 million, but it turned out he asked $500,000. Why do you think they were so off?
Yeah, because, I mean, look, he had made a fortune off of various companies. But look, he was a very practical guy, right? Like, when I showed him the financial statements, I'm like, Ron, we're not giving you 25% of our cash. We're just not. So what else would you like to talk about? So my thing was, and I tried to use this when I was doing IPNav, was the name of the company that I started in 2003. I tried to be really candid and do presentations. So another thing that most lawyers would tell you not to do is share claim charts early on and share a presentation as to what you want early on. And I always do that in the first 2 months of the case, always. I want the other side to be armed up with information. And if they care and want to show me something and say, hey, you're just wrong about this. It could be that we don't sell this product in Germany. This isn't how we do it. But if you just call me up and just say it's invalid, we don't infringe, after I've given you claim charts, but you don't want to tell me how it is you don't infringe, or you don't want to tell me what piece of art it's invalid over, then that's a relatively short conversation. But I still don't regret sharing with you the information so that you can make an informed decision. I think that sometimes you've got to overcome that lawyerly instinct. And I'm not being critical of lawyers. I understand why they take the positions they take, but they weren't the right positions for me to share information early on and to get engagement with the other side. I think it just works better when you do that.
A lot of people who would have been in your shoes first time they get approached to license a patent, they're like, patents are the worst. I'm never going to settle. I'd rather spend more money on litigation than paying whatever licensing fees might be. Why was your reaction so different?
I was lucky. Look, I didn't know the rules, right? I just remember Bob and Sean saying, are you really going to do that? And I'd be like, yeah, I am. But to their credit, they would work with me however I did it. But I didn't know there was a rule book. Like, nobody told me. I mean, obviously, several years into it, I started to realize that there was this rule book that almost every firm played by. And look, there were certain people, like Michelle Lee hates my guts. She was the head of Google Patents during my early days, and then she became a director at the USPTO. I could watch her physically be repulsed when we would get on conference calls, and I never took offense to it. I did my best to reason with her, and I understood that she had put a policy in place, and there was nothing I could say or do to change that policy, and so be it.
But why do you think she had such a reaction? Was it like almost like a religion, not to...
Listen, particularly in Silicon Valley, that did become the religion, right? Like, a very high percentage of the people who were involved in the IP space defending infringers just became convinced that it was purely evil, that anybody would accuse them of infringement, whether it was Erich Spangenberg or, Microsoft. I don't really know what gave rise to it, because I'll tell you what, I think it's had horrific implications in the broader economy. If there's a book that the people who are watching this, they haven't read yet, I would. It's called Chip Wars. And a funny stat, if you look at the Amazon rating on it, it has a higher rating than the Bible. The Bible's 4.8, this is 4.9. But what it's the story of is the whole chip evolution between the US, Europe, to a lesser extent, but they're important players today, and China, and how we got to where we are. And one of the things that I just never understood was that companies like Intel, that actually were hard technology people, and by nature somehow joined forces with Google, that was an advertising company, and thought that somehow or another their interests were aligned, and they weren't. So the AIA clearly weakened the patent system, but you had on these same companies, it's not Google so much, but Intel and others, saying that China was stealing their intellectual property. And I don't know how many politicians have explained, you can't steal a patent. It's already public, right? Like, what you're talking about trade secrets, maybe? Those you can steal, but patents you can't steal. And so it was really interesting to me to see that. And now we're coming full circle again in the US. And I think politicians are starting to say, hey, what did happen to this innovation thing? Well, if you ask me, what happened is that you had the wrong people leading the charge to reduce the effectiveness of the IP system. And we're now seeing that. It can be changed, but understand that you also have sitting on the other side of you now a China that has a much better patent system. And don't feed me the line of bullshit that everybody tries to feed me that, yeah, but they're low quality patents. No, they're not. They were from 2002 to 2011 or 12, but since 2012, the quality's gone up dramatically. And so I think that the West made a mistake. I mean, I was elated to see how the EU reacted with the UPC. I hope that they hold the line on how they view patents in Germany and France and a couple other countries. I think that the US clearly was on the wrong side of that argument, but maybe course correcting on that. Maybe if Trump gets elected and they put somebody decent in as the head of the USPTO, even though they effectively serve a 3-year term at best, maybe we'll see some of that turn around.
One of the things that you mentioned is that these same operating companies that complain about patent trolls one day, they're the ones who are then enforcing their own patents or monetizing patents or selling off patents the next day.
Or complaining about China, right? Like, I mean, look, we have this thing in the US called corporate welfare. And so I'm largely disgusted by it, right? So these same companies who complain about the poor woman who lives in Detroit getting $400 a month for each one of her kids, they'll gladly accept billions of dollars in tax breaks or government subsidies. And oh, by the way, to continue to pay themselves $25 million a year and fly around in the corporate jet, right? So I just find the duplicity of this just beyond the pale. And I don't blame the CEOs largely because I don't think they know, right? That was the group of people I met with in 2000 who were just mouthing back whatever the lawyers told them. And there's obviously exceptions, the CEO of Qualcomm, the CEO of most pharmaceutical companies, they get it. But the tech CEOs don't begin to understand what it is they're being told to advocate for that they advocate for. But I think that the way it's evolving with trade secrets in particular is important. And so hopefully that the US can get back on track and it hasn't done terminal damage. I mean, solving what is and isn't patentable would be a really nice thing. Getting 101 under control would be a really nice thing. Talked to somebody yesterday who was like, well, do you think could we put injunctions back in place? And I'm like, that's probably a little bit too much to hope for. But I think there are things that Congress can and will do that will make the system better.
So my question is, do you think people within these companies are becoming more level-headed?
I do. They're starting to suffer from what it is their predecessors did. And so it's not a great example because there's other reasons behind it. But looking at people, there was a big company that recently dropped out of lot. And I'm sure that what they were doing is that going, what in God's name are we doing, right? Like it's who thought this was a good idea? I fundamentally believe that the only reason that IBM joined was because they bought Red Hat. They would have but for them buying Red Hat, they would have never done that. And they managed to take you can just look at their financial statements and see it. They've taken them down from over $1 billion a year to some number that they no longer report. So you can assume that's a significantly smaller number. And that was 90% margin business to them, I suspect. So I'm sure that you'll see this new group come in. Most of the Red Hat people are gone. And somebody eventually will question, hey, why did we do this? And what were we thinking of? So we'll go from there, see what happens. But I do think that this just is an optimism on part. I can actually give you data points where I see things changing.
There's not a lot of people in the patent field that there's these huge profiles in the New York Times, but I'll read a bit of an excerpt from it. It said, Mr. Spangenberg, the 53-year-old owner of IPwe, is calling to discuss a patent held by one of his clients, which he says your company is infringing. And what are you going to do about it, Mr. Spangenberg? They go through a little bit of a role playing that I guess that you do, where you start out nice, but then you're not nice.
So that reporter was great. I'm actually still friends with him. And we weren't friends, but we became friends afterwards. That reporter spent a day and he came at 11 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning, and spent the whole day with me and then went to dinner with me that night and had the recorder on the whole time. He was like, well, how do you ask somebody for $1 million? And I actually didn't understand what he was asking, but he literally meant like, how would you ask it? And I said, well, you can ask me. And here's what I would say. It's kind of sad. And I don't want to be disrespectful to these people because I know their hopes are really high. But what I find in general is that there's a really big disconnect between what the inventor thinks they invented and what actually gets claimed under the patents, right? And it's sad. And the example I'd use, I think the iPhone came out in 2007. But from 2007 to 2012, we'd get calls from inventors saying, hey, I invented the iPhone. And I'm like, oh my God, that is so awesome. You are going to be super rich. And then when you'd actually go in and look at it, you'd see that it would be some app or some feature that was interesting, but wasn't even in the top 10, right? And so you had to explain to them that, hey, whatever you told your prosecuting lawyer, that's not what survived. And I don't necessarily blame the prosecutors for that because what happens to them is that they're told to keep the cost down to the bare minimum. They think their job is to get the patent issued when what I think their job really should be is to get good patents issued. So when the examiner objects, the easiest thing for them to do is find a way to get around it, traverse it, whatever that word is they use. And so that's sometimes why what the inventor thinks they invented and what the claim set ultimately looks like is a disconnect. And then what happens is, and I remember a buddy of mine, a guy named Roger Kennedy, who was the head of IP at Oracle in 2005, 6, 7. I think he's at Disney now and runs IP there. He was great. And he'd be like, do you believe the number of phone calls I get, I ask them what they want and they'll say $1 billion. And I'm like, no, Roger, I talk to those same people and I just wish them well and don't return their phone calls. So my asks were always, and in fact, I just had to put a presentation together today we're always backed up by facts. So I'll give you links to why I think your product sales are what I think they are. I'll get, particularly when it comes on the damages assets, and I'll even tell you what royalty rate I'm using, and I'll even tell you where I got the information from as to what your product sales were. And if it's wrong, you know what? Show me something where it's wrong, and we can have a conversation. And I certainly understand that there's a risk we'll lose, so you got to discount it for that. There's a time value of money and spending money on lawyers, there's a discount to that. So I try to go through and lay all those things out for them to show them how I got to what I got to. And if they disagree, that's fine. And if what they want to do is argue over damages, I love to play in that field. And I'm perfectly comfortable playing in the validity and non-infringement. And certainly on stuff like chip technology, where there will be claim elements that you have a hard time getting a read on, I won't bring those in Europe, right? There's generally no discovery here, so it's just not a great jurisdiction to bring stuff unless you've got it nailed down on an element by element basis. Those work better in the United States where you can get some discovery. But I try to be informed on all those areas. But if somebody just says, well, it's invalid, and I say why, and they can't even give me a 101 reference, much less a couple of 103 references to get me there, I'll listen to them, and I'll actually then tell them, I'll say, hey, listen, just general invalidity doesn't exist, right? Like you could say it's unpatentable because I'm claiming an active nature or something, but like that's not what we're doing here. So what is it that makes it invalid? And when they just say, well, I don't know, it's just invalid, I realize that's going to be a difficult conversation, and I politely disengage from discussing that any further and wait till they get better educated by whoever their lawyers are.
I guess my question was a higher level about, you've been very successful in negotiation about getting parties to settle with you. Do you have a philosophy about how to negotiate well? How do you get somebody to settle that?
I mean, I really like to lay out scenarios for them. And I never deny the fact, right? Like when you're a patent owner, particularly in the US, if all I know is that you're a patent owner and you're a company that's infringing, and I was going to put up odds in Las Vegas, as the patent owner, you're a 1-for-8 underdog. So if you go in too charged up and don't have the facts and lay it out, so I always like to supply a presentation. And I spend hours on those presentations, and I share the claim charts right away. And so I think that the key is to exchange that. And I don't worry about 408 agreements. I don't care. You want to bring one of those into the jury box so the jury can stare at it, God bless you. And I frankly think it's good. I want the jury to know that we tried to work something out. I mean, obviously that testimony never comes in, but I just think it's really bad advice to not share information early in the process and as detailed as you can provide it so that the person you're accusing of infringement knows that you've done some work. Because then when they report back to whoever they report back to, they're not going to say, hey, this is some idiot that just saw 7 numbers on a piece of paper and decided to file a complaint. They can tell their boss, whoever it is, or their risk manager, whoever they're reporting to, is say, hey, you know what, this group has done their work and we might want to do it. So I know that a lot of times people gave me credit for being a good negotiator, and I'm pretty good at it. But the thing that made me good at it is that I was armed up with good information, had done a ton of work before I ever had that conversation. And to me, that was the key, is that you go in prepared and you go in willing to share information. And it's a mistake to be obtuse or not respond or say, well, I can't tell you that. It just makes you look weak.
So I guess that gives me some faith in the system, right? If you have good patents and there's a clear infringement, then the other party will be reasonable and you won't have...
No, look, not always, but they get smarter as they go along, right? And particularly when you're asking for millions of dollars, they're not going to write you a check the first month. And you just need to acknowledge it. Say, I will tell people, hey, I want to share this information with you to educate you. Your lawyers will tell you that I'm out to lunch and I'm crazy, but remember what they do for a living, right? And remember how they get paid, right? Look, the truth is, I've been doing this so long, most of the people I know, it can be a relatively short conversation because they've heard it before and they know that we come prepared.
You mentioned the American Invents Act. There's news about you teaming up with Kyle Bass to try to use the AIA to invalidate pharma patents. Why were you interested in that? At least from my perspective, it didn't seem to quite work.
My primary motivator to do that was to show people the idiocy of what they had done. So if pharma in any way thought that their interests were aligned with tech in Silicon Valley, they were just wildly misled. And a huge motivation in doing that was to show people the folly of the AIA. I think that how pharma got brought into that, I have no idea. I mean, who thought it was a good idea to say any person could challenge a patent, right? You don't even have to be in suit. So I think that Patrick Leahy who was the senator from New Hampshire who pushed that endlessly, Bob Good, nominal Republican. I think they did a lot to hurt American innovation. And I hope that at some point in time, a few more years need to pass yet, but somebody will go back and take a hard look at what those guys did. And we should recognize that what they did was hurt American innovation significantly.
So one thing that I might take away from that was that it is relatively easy to invalidate a patent in general at the PTAB, but pharma patents, I guess the PTAB wasn't willing to.
Look, we've subsequently done FOIA requests, and years later we got the information. And I've talked to a bunch of the PTAB judges who were judging us, and they were like, so Michelle Lee was the same woman we talked about from Google. She was appalled when we did it. And so they were told that pharma patents were special and they could take a different look at those. We did that from 2013 to 2018. And today, it's a tool used by brand and generic going back and forth all the time. So what was one of the worst things you could do, there was another New York Times article on that with Kyle and I in a picture. It was horrible what we were doing, killing babies, whatever it was we were doing. And today, it's just part of the playbook between branded and generic. And I realized that is blurred a little bit. You have companies with generic products and branded products in the same portfolio, but they're all using that strategy now. So I think that one, Kyle and I were just a little ahead of our time, but it's now a business tool all of them use.
I want to talk a bit about IPwe. Can you tell us what the idea for that was? What is your vision and why do you think it played out the way?
Yeah, well, so my vision changed a lot. There's a really smart guy in the IP space named Jim Malachowski, and he runs a company called Ocean Tomo. And he did something called IPXI in, I can't remember when, 2010 maybe? No, maybe a little before that actually, 2007, 2008. And he had the idea to create a licensing exchange. And it didn't work for a bunch of reasons, but not because of his lack of intellect, his lack of foresight, or his lack of trying. And so when that was going through a bankruptcy, I tried to buy it from Elliott owned it. Elliott had put a few $1 million into it for some reason, but they didn't. They would rather write it off than do it. So I interviewed a bunch of the people who worked at IPXI, and Jim had collected a really good team of people and tried to figure out why it didn't work. So I thought that the main problem they had was that it didn't scale. Like they weren't using, because they didn't exist, electronic systems to accelerate certain processes. So the original thought with IPwe was, hey, we could use blockchain technology and AI, which at the time was not generative AI, it was predictive analytics, to make it so that would scale. It just didn't work. Like it's after 5 years, we kept trying, and it just didn't take off. And then generative AI came along, and we started to see what those systems can do. And I really thought, a year and a half ago, LLMs are the things that make large language models, the thing that makes generative AI work. And I really thought that what happened was that there'd have to be a specialized LLM, one focused on IP, one focused on whatever it is you're doing, in order to be effective. And I was wrong there as well. So IPwe filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago. The auction is in a month or so. I'll bid on the assets. I'll get them back. But I'm going to have to reconfigure how IPwe does what it does. But I've got $14 million of my own money tied up in that one. So I'm not giving up on that. But it definitely needed to get a bath. If you remember, I started out as a restructuring lawyer. So I actually believe in restructurings. And so, yeah, I'm not ready to tell you what it is right now. But I'll tell you that it is coming back out. And I'm going to actually insert, if I'm the successful bidder, I'll insert it into one of my other operations. So my main day-to-day business now, and has been for the last year and a half, and that invests in IP financing opportunities across the spectrum. So whether it's royalties, IP litigation, IP credit, IP structured equity, and that's been something that I've wanted to do for years and years as well, is that I wanted to do it without raising a fund off my own capital, but I've wandered back into the raising. I can't help myself. Every once in a while I go back in and raise capital. So we'll raise a couple $100 million to do that. And you'll probably see that launch in the next, probably before, you'll see that publicly before September.
What are your thoughts about a marketplace for patents in general?
I don't. So one of the mistakes that I made at IPwe is I literally tried to boil the ocean. I would have been much better off focusing in on some narrow thing and not trying to do things with all patents. The other mistake that I made, and I mean, it's a long list of mistakes, obviously. The other mistake I made was that I didn't think about it globally, and I was too focused on the United States. And so there's just certain jurisdictions, shockingly enough, China, for example, where a market type system would work. I think Japan is another one where it would work. And I think that the toughest sell would be the United States. And particularly because the very people who lead it are sort of the Silicon Valley types who they just don't need it, right? They don't have any interest in it. So it's not helpful to them at all. But I think that the European mentality is slightly more open to it. I know that Japan's more open to it, and I know that China's more open to it. So what you'll see is that a guy who's worked with me for 10 years, he's starting it in China now, in Henan or Shanghai. It'll be one or the other place. And so we'll piggyback off what he's doing. And I know that in the West, it's really popular to hate China, to test anything they do, no matter what it is. So the relationship between the companies will be very loose. But there's still, just so people know, there's still a whole bunch of Western companies operating in China, even though all they do is endlessly bitch about it. But there is an opportunity. And I think once people see it working, that it'll be easier for them to comprehend what it is. And so let me give you a classic space where it should work is SEP patents, right? So the last thing we want is a group in Alicante, Spain, controlling the global SEP market, but that's what the EU is trying to do. And I think it'll just be too ironic when China's the one that comes up with the market-based solution. I can't wait. And I think that will be the opportunity. So again, focusing in on a narrower country-by-country markets and then focusing in on a much narrower subset of the patents is what you have to do before there's broader. And I'm friends with Sean Antanabe, who runs Unified Patents, and super negative on patents. It's just too funny. I admire Sean. He's a super smart guy. He just sent me an email he's like, you understand that 95% of the world's patents are worthless. So why don't you advocate for a system where we just file on the 5%? And I'm like, I don't think that's a bad idea. I think that large companies tend to carpet bomb for a reason. So they're the ones who don't want to have some standard at which they file at. But I would certainly be very comfortable with a system where there was a significant reduction in the number of patents and the relevancy and value of those rose. I don't have any problem with that. So I'm not an advocate for whatever system it is that I think would work best. I think that what you'll see is that new IPwe will get focused on that piece. And I'll probably still spend more of my time on Savregar financing because that's where I have the most fun. But we'll see what the new IPwe looks like. We'll probably not fully appreciate that until September.
And you mentioned some of the newer trends that we're seeing in the market, the role of litigation finance, maybe a move towards more high-quality patents instead of just obtaining patents. Anything else that kind of excites you about?
I think this weird argument of can generative AI be an inventor? I don't know, but what I would say is that Sean's view is that, and other people share this view, I'm not picking on Sean, that, that will invalidate all patents. And I'm like, no. I use generative AI many times a day, and people far smarter than me and high level in R&D groups are using it as well. And there's still a whole bunch of white space, even with generative AI. I don't know whether that'll be true in 5 years or not, where there's still a lot to invent that generative AI isn't going to, quote unquote, invent for you. So I think that generative AI will actually improve the patent space because hopefully examiners and other people will start using it. I remember a time, including during Michelle Lee's reign, where the examiners in the U.S. were forbidden from using Google for some reason. I can't remember what the rationale was. But I hope that we're past that. And so I would like to think that generative AI, for all of us, is going to spot prior art earlier. And I don't think it'll do it at like a detailed claim level right away. I do think it will do it at a level where you should say, oh, you know what? It keeps talking about this guy Sikorsky who wrote some article. Maybe I should go read that before I file my patent. So I'm actually encouraged by how generative AI could be used to improve the quality of IP. I think it'd be a big assist, and that's how we'll see it in 5 years. I don't think we'll see it as terminating all patents. I think it will actually result in there being better patents.
I actually agree because at least in my field of patent prosecution, there's a lot of talk about it helping with efficiency, but I think there's a lot that AI can do to improve the patents that you get. So,
yeah, no, I don't view it as a threat. I understand people who do view it as a threat. I think it's a threat to a whole bunch of jobs. I share Elon Musk's view of the world on that, but specifically as it comes to patents in the metal process, I think we've got a little bit of room to run there.
So a few final questions. One is somebody is listening to this and they say, well, I want to get into patent monetization. What advice would you give them? how does someone know they would be good at what you do?
I get these inquiries on LinkedIn. So I don't think that most people have my email, but you can always find me on LinkedIn. And typically when people ask me, I'll give them 5 minutes of time and talk to them. I give talks to a lot of universities, and Brown I do every year. Invariably get asked that question. And I'm like, well, isn't there something like more productive that you want to do? So the first thing I do is I try to talk about it, right? And then the second thing I say, hey, are you ready? Like, if you're going to do it in the U.S., are you ready to be served when you leave temple on Friday night or church on Sunday? Like, you ready for that? Like, because it's going to happen. And if you're ready for that, then do it. But I think practically, I'd say, hey, what's your strategy going to be that everybody else is not using, right? Going back to the beginning of our conversation today, mine was, I realized that I had to be not the smartest, not the hardest working, not the best value, but au contraire, I had to do other things in order to get noticed. And then I had to develop practices like being super forthcoming and providing presentations, stuff like that. So I think that there's innovation in the monetization space. There's still tons of room to go there. And so if somebody, I would honest with them and say, hey, it's not particularly easy. There are probably more rewarding careers out there. But if you're passionate about it and this is what you think your calling is, knock yourself out. Here's what I did. And you can listen to Eli's podcast and see what you want. But I try not to discourage people. I try to just say, hey, don't look at the people who made a ton of money doing it, because there's a lot of roadkill in this space, as well as outstanding lawyers who tried to be IP monetization specialists who they just weren't cut out to do it. So be honest.
And do you think there's something that those people share why they weren't cut out to do it?
Yeah, because it's advocacy isn't going to carry the day when you're doing this. It's literally going to be asset management. And so, look, you could be critical of the people who file and settle for $100,000 over and over. Copyright trolls. Now we're starting to see privacy trolls. It's a business model. It was not one that I was particularly wild about, but it was certainly a business model. So tell me what your business model is going to be, and I'll tell you what I think you need to be ready for. So if you're going to try to replicate Eran Zur, right, there's somebody you should hold in high regard, right? He's doing 30% IRRs at Fortress with a lot of money under management, which is not easy to do. I mean, it's one thing to do great returns on 50 million. It's quite another thing to do great returns on a couple billion. See if you can get to Eran and figure out what he did. I mean, Eran elephant hunts. He's always been of that mentality, and it worked for him. And Eran's not a guy who will negotiate with you. He'll tell you what the number is, and if you won't give it to him, he doesn't care. He'll go down in flames, and he's perfectly fine with that. And it's another strategy. So again, what I would say to people is, like, Erich Spangenberg's strategy worked for Erich Spangenberg. The Eran Zur strategy worked for Eran Zur. Pick your own.
Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget that new episodes of Clause 8 come out every 2 weeks, so be sure not to miss them by subscribing at clause8podcast.com and wherever you listen to podcasts.